Today's class is lesson 12, and this is to explain a common question that people have, and that is, if there's one religion, how did we turn into many different customs? How do we turn into different prayer books, different ways that we recite certain blessings on the holidays, different foods that different communities eat? Is it a contradiction? Is this anarchy, or is this intentional or part of the process? So let's begin with the introduction, and Eliyahu, if you'd like to read.
Lesson 12, Introduction to Jewish Law. Is there one way to correctly practice halakha? Discussion and debate are the hallmark of Talmud study. However, in halakhic debate over a practical law, we can only act according to a single opinion. Does that mean there's only one way to correctly practice halakha? Is there any point in learning about the options that we do not follow?
Very good. So this is the
I meant
question.
opinions.
Yeah, but this is the question that one can ask. This is the discussion that comes up constantly when people go to a new synagogue, a new community, and they see things that they haven't done before, and they say, well, we didn't do it this way. Who's right? Who's wrong? And that's what this class is going to discuss, to give us a perspective on how we view different opinions. And Caroline, if you'd like to read big idea number 1.
Okay. Many legitimate options, one legitimate practice. Big idea. Number 1, many legitimate options, one legitimate practice. When there is debate on actual halakh practice, only one opinion is followed. However, both resigners are, I'm doing this from my iPhone, are considered words with words of the living God and contain truth that must be studied.
Very good. So this is to clarify that, yes, there could be different opinions, but we view them all as the word of God. And if you use the example of optical illusions, you can check out this video. It's a little bit of a lengthier video, but you can check it out later online on YouTube if you put this in. So it gives you many optical illusions, and it could be used as an example for how you could have different views about how you perceive something.
Here are 10 optical illusions on YouTube. Number 10, Lilac Chaser. The Lilac Chaser is also commonly called the Pac-Man illusion. The illusion is comprised of 12 lilac circles that have blurred edges. They are arranged in a circle around a small black cross. The lilac circles move around in a clockwise direction, disappearing briefly one at a time. You need to stare at the illusion for about 5 seconds for the illusion to work. Once you do, you will notice a green disc replaces the lilac discs. The illusion has to do with the colors of the discs. Interestingly enough, if the discs were blue, then you would see a yellow disc replace the blue one. Number 9.
So that's just to get an idea that we have with this optical illusion. We could use the same example for how people can view certain laws in the Torah. It's not a right or wrong. There could be, depending on what one is focusing on. So let's use over here the text number 1 with the introduction. Sheila, if you'd like to read, starting from perhaps.
Okay. Perhaps the most famous of the halakhic debates recorded throughout the Talmud are between the academies of rabbis Hillel and Shammai. Both these and those are words of the living God. The academies of Hillel and Shammai, or by Hillel and Beit Shammai, have dozens of halakhic debates recorded throughout Talmud. They had opposite views of the world, which resulted in opposing rulings. In the following passage, the Talmud describes how one particularly long-standing debate was resolved. Shall I read the rest?
Yeah, if you could read text number 1. And this is a quote from the Talmud.
Okay. Rabbi Abba said, in the name of Shmuel, for 3 years, the academies of Shammai and the Hillel disagreed. These said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion, and those said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, a divine voice emerged, proclaimed, both these and those are words of the living God.
Very good. So we see clearly here that they have a dispute. These disputes are still studied till this very day, even though we decided regarding a specific dispute that the halacha, the final verdict, the law, follows one opinion, yet we continue to study both opinions because they are both the word of the living God. Meaning, and we're going to explain this in greater detail momentarily, just because they have opposing opinions doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. They could both be right, even though practically we only follow one of them. And as we'll have on this slide over here, can two opposite be true at once? Two opposite things, can they be both true? We'll use the example of one being happy and sad at the same time. Let's use this slide for a moment. Two people can see things and everyone is sure that they see it correctly, but they're just speaking about how they are seeing it from their perspective, and both are true. So we'll continue with a quote from the Talmud, which will explain this in greater detail. And let's go to text number 2. And John, I see you're on. If you'd like to read text number 2.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
A person might say, now, how can I study Torah when it contains so many different opinions? The verse states that they are all given from one shepherd. One God gave them. One leader, Moses, said them from the mouth of the master of all creation, blessed be he. As the verse states, and God spoke all these words. The plural form of words indicates that God transmitted all interpretations of the Ten Commandments. Since the sages invariably utilize the Torah itself or the statements of the prophets as sources of their opinions, there is a certain unity to the study of the Torah, despite the numerous explanations and applications. So to you, the student, make your ears like a funnel and acquire for yourself an understanding heart to hear both the statements of those who render objects ritually impure and the statements of those who render them pure, the statements of those who prohibit actions and the statements of those who permit them, the statements of those who deem items invalid and the statements of those who deem them valid.
Very good. So do different opinions make the Torah less divine? Do we say, well, if there's too many opinions, must be that it's not divine? The answer is, on the contrary, not at all. And the opposite is true, because it's divine. And God is so limitless. God is infinite. Therefore, when we have difference of opinion, it's because it all traces back to God, and God sees it in unlimited amount of ways, or in many ways, and therefore we can have different opinions depending on what one focuses on. So of course, the final verdict will only follow one opinion, but we study all of the opinions and how to analyze it because it's all part of God's wisdom. Let's read on the next text over here. And Eliyav, if you'd like to read.
There's room for different perspectives. How is it possible that two conflicting opinions are both words of the living God? These and these are the words of the living God. The rabbis of France asked, how is it possible that they can both be the words of the living God if one prohibits and one permits? They answered, when Moses ascended on high at Sinai to receive the Torah, God showed him 49 reasons to prohibit and 49 reasons to permit. Moses asked God about this. God responded that permission to decide was given to the Torah scholars among the Jewish people in each generation.
There you go. So we'll pull up this slide. When it comes to the job to decide if something bottom line should be permitted or prohibited, of course, the opinions, we have many opinions, but bottom line, who decides? And the answer is, based on the text we just read, it's the Torah scholars that decide, meaning not to say that they can make up something on their own. They're following how they understand God's message, and God wants it to be that they will follow their understanding, which of course this refers to anyone that is a serious Torah studier, someone that devotes themselves to the legitimacy of the Torah. They understand that it's the word of God, and they want to understand how to interpret it. This is intentional, that God gave us the Torah, and he said, there are many different ways to view it, and I want the majority of the scholars, when they get together and decide what should be the bottom line, based on their understanding, that is the way God wants it to be followed. We have over here on the screen some paradox phrases. Two of these are not, but I know that I know nothing, or he was too tired to sleep. Number 3 is not a paradox. But the other ones, these are statements that we constantly use. I can't resist anything but temptation, or not that constantly used, but statements that people can use, or statements that can just be a paradox. And that is, in life, there can sometimes be aspects which seem like a paradox, and it's okay for there to be the difference within the two opinions, even though they're paradoxical one to the other, but yet they could still both be opinions that we want to study. And as we'll have on this slide, the paradox again of the blue button is true, the red button is false. Ultimately, what is the truth? So we can have the various opinions, but it doesn't mean that everything is false. And it means just that bottom line, we have to follow one, but we want to study all of the opinions as to how to get to the bottom line. As the famous joke goes, we'll say it outside, of a rabbi that was trying to resolve a dispute. One guy says his side, and the rabbi says, you're right. The other guy says his side, and the rabbi says, you're also right. So a third guy says, well, Rabbi, how can they both be right if they're arguing? He says, well, you're also right. We sometimes want to give everybody the right of way. We want to allow everybody to be right, which has truth to it. We could, bottom line, we have to come to a conclusion, but not to dispel someone else's opinion. And this happens, of course, a lot in Supreme Court or in Congress or in the Senate or any place like our election system. Everybody has their opinion, and they could all be right in a certain degree. But bottom line, we have to follow, there's one president, there's one Supreme Court, and there's one law that the Supreme Court gives out. There's not 9 different opinions to every law, and now pick and choose. So that is similar to the way Judaism is set up in that area as well. And this is another example on how to explain this. If you have all these dots and you give it out to everyone and you say, draw a picture, make an image based on these dots, everyone will make a different image, and they're all nice, they're all good, they're all valid images, because when God gave us the Torah, yes, he gave us the base, but there's so many ways that one can explain each and every concept, and they're all considered valid as long as one follows the basic guidelines in how to read the Torah, not that they make up their own interpretations. Let's read the next text, which again explains this. This is from the Maharal, a rabbi that lived just about 500 years ago in the city of Prague, Czechoslovakia. And Sheila, if you'd like to read, diversity.
Diversity is built, it says, I can't, something system by God. Thus, the different opinions in the Talmud are simply highlighting different true aspects of the case in front of us. Rabbi Yehuda Loew, the Maharal of Prague, Ber Hagala. When God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, he made the Torah reflect upon the true reality of this world. In Torah, God said that a particular case has an aspect which leads to a person being ruled innocent and an aspect leading to a person being ruled guilty. Another case has an aspect which leads to it being prohibited and an aspect which leads to it being permitted. Just as items in the world are compromised by different substances, even simple substances such as wood and water, simply regarding Torah. Nothing is totally impure without having any aspect of purity. Therefore, different Torah scholars will focus on different aspects, and one will say pure and one will say impure. Just as the one God, the master of the world, created a complex world, similarly, every Torah topic has, I can't read the last sentence. Oh, okay.
There.
No, simple, but God created every aspect of this world, and he is the one who imbued this matter with two contradictory aspects. Regarding practical ruling, we need to follow only one opinion, but one who listens to all the different opinions will understand the different aspects to the case and will learn Torah as the matter truly stands.
Very good. So what he's saying, in short, is that diversity is built into the system by God, just as God made everything in the world made up of multiple elements. So too, when it comes to seemingly contradictory perspectives, it's not saying that one is really fake, one is false, but rather it's the way God set it up that each thought process can have both sides. And as those that debate, those that are involved in any law will say, yes, every law that you're pro has some sides to it that you can be against. There's nothing that has in it the one solution for it all. It all has its pros, its cons, and one can argue for each side, explaining why it should be permitted, why it should be prohibited, why it should be allowed or not allowed, and so on in every case. So this is part of the divine. Because it is divine, therefore it has so many different ways that one can look at it. Let's read text number 5. This is from Rabbi Kook, from a rabbi in the land of Israel, one of the chief rabbis many years ago. And Caroline, if you'd like to read text number 5.
Okay. Text number 5. Oops, come on. Wait, okay. Rabbi Eleazar said that Rabbi Hanina said, for Torah scholars, increase peace in the world. Those who think that world peace will be built only through one type of opinion and characteristic are mistaken. If so, when they see Torah sages researching wisdom through the study, the perspectives, the opinions increase. They think that they are causing disputes and the opposite of peace. In truth, it is not so. Rather, true peace is impossible to come to the world only when all of the perspectives are seen together and all the opinions that there are in wisdom, and it will be clarified how each one has a place corresponding to its value and matter. All aspects of true wisdom are revealed. It will be seen that only through gathering together all the opinions that seem different can we see the light and truth and righteousness, righteousness and knowledge of God, his fear and love and light of the Torah. Thus, Torah scholars increase peace in the world through their expansion and clarify and give birth to new words of wisdom with different twists that increase and are different. Just as a building must be built from different parts, the truth of the light of the world is built from diverse sides, from different opinions.
So let's use an example that's pretty applicable. Everyone had it at one point in their life, and that is, imagine you're a parent and your child breaks curfew. They come home too late, and now you have two ways to react. You can either apply the rule to the fullest extent and teach the child a very valuable lesson called discipline. Or you can bend the rule, give some leeway, and teach the child another great attribute, an attribute of compassion, of forgiveness, and of being flexible for another person. And one will ask, what's the correct approach? And the answer is, everyone knows that you need to teach both. You need to teach compassion and you need to teach discipline. You may not be able to use them both at the same moment. You have to decide on each scenario if you're using one or two, but at the core, both messages are good. Even though they're opposing, they're still both very important parenting messages that one has to give over. And the parent may choose that one time they'll respond to the same crisis with discipline and another time with passion, with compassion. So too, when it comes to how we view the Torah, like we just read in this text, Caroline, which you just read, the word shalom, peace, comes from also the word shlemut, which means completion. That how do we reach a true state of completion when we have all the pieces of the puzzle so that they fit together and all opinions are accounted for? Only then can we achieve true peace. True peace is not one dominates and crushes all opposing matter, but rather they know how to harmonize and combine everything together and say, because of the diversity, that's how we come out with the beautiful goal. Not to say, again, that there is no final verdict, but even with the final verdict, we still study the other opinion because they are all ultimately from the divine source, just as the parent has multiple ways that they can respond to their child. Let's read over here this quote and then text number 6. And John, if you'd like to read.
Am I supposed to read the headings too?
Yeah.
Or okay.
Yeah, if you could read that, yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure how to pronounce the first word there.
Bait,
Bait.
bait.
Bait. And then what's the second word?
So it's Beit Shammai and Bet Hillel. These are two schools of thought. These were two rabbis, Shammai and Hillel, that lived about 2,000 years ago, and they had students which were very different in opinions. They opposed each other a lot.
Oh, okay. Different ways to look at the rainbow. That's nice. Circling back to the academies of Shammai and Hillel, their differences of opinion contribute greatly to the overall beauty of the halachic,
and that's the Jewish law.
Okay, fabric. In a fascinating talk, the Labivid, I'm not sure how to.
Yes. By the way, let me just give a heads up. Any word that you don't know how to read, it's fine. Just skip it. Some of them are Hebrew words that are put in, so don't worry about it. Yeah, just skip the words you don't know.
Explain how their arguments throughout the entire halachic corpus are not arbitrary at all, but rather represent a fundamentally different way of thinking and viewing the world. It was this point of view that propelled their arguments throughout. The Rebbe identified the core difference between the two ways of thinking, showing how this one difference is the common idea between every difference of opinion in the two schools had. And then
so let me show you over here this slide. So we have here, you could have a common thread between each argument that these great sages had. And I'll say outside, what's the common thread? It's a little bit of a longer text just to keep with the time strains. There's a dispute regarding the holiday of Hanukkah. We all light one night. On the first night, we light one candle. Second night, 2 candles. Until the 8th night, we light 8 candles. That is actually just one of the opinions in the Talmud. There's another opinion, Shammai. He says that on the first night, you should light 8 candles. The second night, 7. Until the last night, you light 1. So one says you increase and one says you decrease. What is the reason for them arguing? They're not just arguing because they are looking for arguments, but each one is basing it upon his approach to life, how he looks at everything in life, how he looks at everything in the Torah. And that is Hillel, the opinion that says we light 1, then 2, then 3. He says we look at the potential of what there is going to be. Sorry, the opinion that says you light 8 says we look at the potential. The opinion that says you light 1 says we look at the concrete, what we have right now. We focus on the practical. So the opinion that says we focus on the practical says right now, it's the first night of Hanukkah. We only have 1 light we only had 1 day of celebration, so we light one. The second night, we already did 2 days of celebration, we can light a second one, because he looks at the practical. The other school of thought that says light 876, he says we look at the potential. Potentially right now, with the first night of Hanukkah, I have 8 days coming up of joy. I should light 8 candles. I didn't celebrate the 8 days yet, but I'm going to be celebrating 8 days. I should light 8 candles. When a day passes, I only have 7 days left that are coming. So my potential is smaller. I light 7. The last night, I only have the potential of 1 more day, so I light 1 more candle. That's 2 ways that they approach how to view Jewish law. So when the rabbi said, light the menorah on Hanukkah, each one had his way. One guy says, I look at what I have right now, the practical. The other one says, I look at the potential, what I will have. And so on. It's a lengthy talk where he explains dispute after dispute in the Talmud based on this common thread that these 2 rabbis had. Now we have to clarify and say that even though everybody's opinion when it comes in the Talmud and the dispute between the rabbis is studied, nevertheless, it's important to remember that the bottom line, there's one law. And Sheila, if you'd like to read this page.
The law is the law. While differing opinions are all valid in theory, there is only one law that we practically follow. Torah and halakha are not relativistic. Relativism is the theory that knowledge, truth, and morality exist in relation to culture, society, and historical context, and are not absolute. Halakha is emphatically not so. When a ruling is made, it is set in stone and must be complied with. It is very rigid. The law is a law.
Yeah, okay, and if you'd like to read text number 6.
I'm sorry. The Midrash famously declares, Midrash Bamidbar, there are 70 faces to the Torah.
Very good. So there are 70 faces to the Torah, means that there's 70 ways that one can interpret it and understand it, but yet the law is bottom line, the law. And as we'll have in this little drawing over here, imagine someone says, my client pleads not guilty because cultural relativism, that he grew up in a society where this is okay. If we had such a system, we would never be able to have justice. We would never have a normal society with laws. So the Torah tells us that God dictates, the law is the law. There's one law, but yet at the same time, God also says that there are 70 modes of interpretation in order for one to get to the final conclusion of the law. Let's read over here in the next text where he's going to explain about, as much as we accept many opinions, it's not unlimited opinions that anyone can come and say, this is the opinion that I have, and it's just as valid. And Caroline, if you'd like to read.
Text number 8.
Yeah.
Text number 8. My conception of pluralism and the Jewish religious community can be best summed up by the reference to a famous dictum in the Jewish tradition, that there are shivam panim la Torah. There are 70 faces or 70 facets to Torah. No one is more valuable or significant or legitimate than the other 69. Judaism is monolithic. However, there are only 70. The number, of course, is arbitrary, is not an infinite number of such faces or facts. A pluralism that accepts everything as co-legitimate is not pluralism, but the kind of relativism that leads to spiritual nihilism. If everything is kosher, nothing is kosher. If Torah is an infinite number of faces, then it is faceless and without value or significance. Orthodox Jews are fully aware of the Talmud's comment on the disputes between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, that both these and these are the words of the living God. Unfortunately, this profound statement has been abused and turned into a slogan by ignoring the fact that the controversialists were at one in their commitment to the halakha and its divine origin, and disagreed only on its interpretation with regard to very specific matters. The dictum implies a pluralism without the halakhic content only. It simply cannot be stretched to cover all interpretations of Judaism as co-legitimate.
So to summarize what he says, we'll have these 2 points, and that is, what are the 2 ideas that one can take out from the phrase which we had up here? There are 70 faces to the Torah. The answer is, on the one hand, Judaism has room for different opinions, but on the other hand, there are limits. We don't say there's unlimited faces to the Torah. Anyone can interpret as they please. We say there are only 70, meaning within the parameters of one that is staying loyal to the divine message, to the text, and they're interpreting according to those guidelines, then there could be many different ways to interpret it. Let's use a simple example of, we'll just show this slide for a moment. So it's not unlimited modes, but there's just 70. But let's use an example. How many routes can one make from your house to school or your house to work? And the answer is, you could probably come up with a handful, a couple dozen maybe, but you wouldn't say there's unlimited methods, because at some point, your method would be going not from your house to the school. It would be going from point A to point B, which is not where you need to go. And you'll say, as much as it looks like it's going to my house, or it looks like it's going to my school, it's not going from the right place to the right place. So too in interpreting Torah, one has to make sure, yes, there are many ways to interpret the Torah, given, if you are careful, that you're starting from the right place and you're ending up in the right place, meaning you're starting from the origin of God and you're ending up with following Jewish law. Then there could be multiple methods in how one goes through this narrow streets in between. Let's read a summary of section number 1. And Sheila, if you'd like to read the summary.
We have covered the first big idea. When there is a debate in practice, only one opinion is followed. However, both are considered word of the living God. Both opinions have truth and must be studied.
Okay. Let's go on now to section number 2. And Elia, if you'd like to read big idea number 2.
Essential system splinters. The High Court in Jerusalem was the central authority of halakha. Once it no longer stood, multiple strains of halakha emerged. The Talmud was the last central authority, and all Jews are bound by the decisions rendered there.
Very good. So this is just a depiction of Rav Ashi teaching his disciples, his students in Babylonia, modern day Iraq. So we have here the first text, I'll just say it outside, which is, it used to be a system very organized like we have today in America, where if one had a question, they go to their local court. If they don't know the answer, they go to a more superior court. Ultimately, if no one knew the answer, they would end up at the Supreme Court. And if they didn't know the answer of Jewish law, they would come to a conclusion and a consensus based on the rabbis that were there. They would take a vote and decide the law. So it was very clear as to what one should do. Let's pull up the slide where you have it similar. You got the local court, the court on the Temple Mount. There's the court in the Chel, which was closer into the temple, and then you have the Supreme Court, which was in the temple. Just like you have the trial court, Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court. What are the benefits when you have a unified system? And the answer is, of course, this allows everyone to be performing the same religion. If everyone were to decide on their own what to do, it would be chaos. You need to follow the majority, which is what's practiced today when it comes to many areas, even in secular fields, like the courts, for example, is an easy place to use, or the House of Representatives. You follow the majority because you have to come to a conclusion as to what we should do. If everyone follows according to their own understanding, we would have millions of different religions and how things should actually be performed. Let's read this following text that brings out this point. And, oh, sorry, went too far. And John, if you'd like to please read text number 10.
Absolutely. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but describes the benefits of this approach. The following comments are from explanations of the mitzvah to the following majority of the Torah scholars. The reason for this mitzvah, we were commanded to strengthen the fulfillment of our religion. If we were simply commanded, keep the Torah according to how you are able to understand its intended truth, every individual would say, I think that the truth follows my opinion. And so, even if the whole world would say the opposite, he would not be allowed to do the matter contrary to the truth. This is great. According to his opinion, destruction would come from this, as the Torah would turn into many Torahs. Yeah, for everyone would judge according to their own humble opinion. But now that we have been explicitly commanded to accept the opinion of the majority of sages about it, there is one Torah for us all, for all of us, thereby gloriously preserving it. We may not budge from their opinion, whatever the case. By adhering to their commandments, we are executing the commandments of God. That was amazing. That was really good.
As the joke goes, a guy walks out of a bar after heavy drinking. He gets into his car, and as he's driving home, his wife gives him a call and says, Tom, did you know there's a drunken driver on the highway driving backwards? Be careful. He said, just one drunken driver? He says, everyone's driving backwards on the highway today. So when one decides that they're going to follow their own path, everybody seems to be different from them and will have chaos. So therefore, there has to be a supreme court which dictates the laws. The problem is that diaspora broke this up. Once the Jews were not anymore in a central location, they didn't have anymore the Supreme Court, and it all started, different rabbis on new development had their own opinions because they weren't all communicating and coming to a final verdict. Think of it as if every state has its Supreme Court, they're not all going to decide everything alike. Each state has their own opinions, and we would have 50 different constitutions for each location. That's sort of what happened with the Jewish people. It wasn't supposed to happen, but ultimately that's what happens when the Jewish people were exiled from their land. Let's read text number 11, and Eliyahu, if you'd like to read.
Talmud relates, Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, a dislocated femur in a bird is kosher. Rabbah bar Rav Huna said to Rav Huna, but the rabbis that came from Pumbedita said, in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, a dislocated femur in a bird renders it non-kosher. Rav Huna said to him, my son, each river and its course. Should I keep?
Yeah, no, so we'll pause there. So he's answering him that yes, each river has its own way that it goes. And therefore I have my opinion, they have their opinion. This was what could happen later on once there wasn't anymore a final court that gives the verdict that everyone must follow. And therefore, from the times of the closing of the Talmud, there was no more a one place authority that all Jews would oblige by, because the Talmud was the last time we had a majority of the scholars in one location and they would come to final verdicts. After that time, the Jews were spread out all over, and therefore each community, this is just to give you an idea, each community ended up following their local rabbi. So Pumbedita, Sura, these are places in modern day Iraq, but at the time was Babylonia, where the Jews were, and this was Jerusalem, where the Jews were before they were exiled out of the land. From then came eventually what we have today, where Jews, this is giving you an idea of the years, where Jews went to each country and eventually left those countries and spread out even further. So at this point already, there was no central location. Each rabbi was giving what works for his community. Yet, important again to point out, even though each rabbi was following what works for his community, there was the base that no one was able to argue on. And that was, up until the Talmud, it was just smaller new additions that came about in each location that each person came up with his opinion. And back in the day, they would sit together and come to a consensus. Today, or from already a few hundred years ago, they weren't able to do that. So eventually we got the different cultures, whether it's Ashkenazi Jews or the Sephardic Jews. And this is a quote from Maimonides, we'll just say outside. He says, until those days, there was one place where they were making all the customs, all the laws, all the decrees. Once it spread out in each and every community, everybody just went to their local rabbi, and that was the place where they can get guidance, but they don't have the authority to force another location to follow them, because he was only dictating the laws for those that were under his rule, those that were under his authority, those that were listening and asking for his guidance. Here's a slide to get an idea of year-wise. The Zugot, which was the prior to the Tanaim, the way we have them in the Mishnah, started already before the Common Era. The Tanaim, the ones that wrote the Mishnah, the Amoraim, which are the ones that are in the Talmud, and then going on to the later generations of the Geonim, and then the Rishonim, which were like Maimonides, Rashi. Those were rabbis that lived about 800 to 1,000 years ago, until modern day times, where you have the latest of the rabbis going back about 500 years ago. So this is just to get an idea of when we're talking about the time of the Mishnah. Each color is giving us another era of rabbis. So until the yellow and partially in the green was a uniform law, from after that, starting already in the blue, is when each community didn't have the ability to communicate with others and come to a one final verdict. Each place had their own understanding and how they're going to go about dealing with each case that came up in their community. So what challenges did migration bring? It brought about that the halachic authority was no longer centralized. So the Babylonian Talmud is the last halachic text. And this is where you have the three general communities that came about, which we're familiar with today. The Ashkenazi Jews, which Ashkenaz in Hebrew is Germany, which spread out eventually to all over Eastern Europe. You have Romanian, Hungarian, the Anglo Jews, the Russians, and so forth. You have the Sephardic Jews, which ended up in South America. Some of them went to America as well many years ago, Cuba and other countries, Mexico. And then you had the Jews that were in the Middle Eastern countries. Yemen was a popular one, but eventually they spread to all over. There were Jews in Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and all the other countries which we're familiar with today. To answer this question, why aren't we compelled to follow what another community did? And the answer is because with the spread of the Jewish communities, there was difficulty communicating. So practices remained local in each location. It's not, again, that one is right, one is wrong. God wants that everyone should follow the guidelines of the Torah and then believe that he is implementing what his mind tells him is the truth. And that is what God wants. So therefore, even if it's different opinions, they're all from the Word of God. Let's summarize section number 2. And Sheila, if you'd like to read the summary.
We have covered the second big idea. The High Court in Jerusalem was the central authority of halakha. Once it no longer stood, multiple strains of halakha emerged. The Talmud was the last central authority, and all Jews are bound by the decisions rendered there.
Very good. So that's section number 2. Let's move on. Let's move on to section number 3. And Elia, if you'd like to read.
Act local. After the Babylonian Talmud was ratified, Jews migrated throughout Europe, North Africa, and Asia. With the lack of central Jewish authority, each community developed its own customs and resolutions for halachic disputes.
Very good. So it doesn't, again, mean that one's right and one's wrong. Let's use a simple example. If you go online and Google the word Sidur, you'll come up with many different Sidurim. I'll pull up over here an example. If you just go on Amazon, type in Siddur, which is the Jewish prayer book. Siddur is like the organized, set up prayer book. There is the standard basic of the text that everyone is equal, but there's always slight differences within each prayer book. Some a rabbi instituted to add this paragraph in honor of this, or in commemoration of that, or in memory of so and so. So they're all prayer books praying to God based on the foundations that the Talmud writes, with slight variations, small changes, each to fit what was working in their community. We'll use an example of a prayer that is recited every day as part of the Shema. In preparation of the Shema, we recite this prayer. So this is the way it is in the Ashkenazi text. You have a translation from one of the translations. Of course, each translation is going to be pretty close to the other, but this is using one example. Now let's move on to this same paragraph in a Dut HaMizrach, which is a Mizrahi prayer book, and we'll highlight over here in bold the differences that you find. So let's just read a few of the lines. Sheila, if you'd like to read, start with the first paragraph, and you'll notice how it's a very similar prayer, but it's slightly different. You could say it's more adding in extra phrases of love or greatness, enhancing it and spicing it up.
You have loved us with an eternal love, Lord our God, and with surpassing compassion have you had compassion on us, our Father, our King, for the sake of your great name and our ancestors who trusted in you and to whom you taught the laws of life to perform your will with a complete heart. Be gracious, our Father, compassionate Father, ever compassionate. Have compassion on us. Instill in our hearts the desire to understand and to discern, to listen, learn and teach, to observe, perform and fulfill all the teaching of your Torah in love. Enlighten our eyes in your Torah, and let our hearts cling to your commandments. Unite our hearts, excuse me, our hearts to love and revere your name, so that we may never put to shame, disgrace, or of stumbling. And because we have trusted in your holy, great, and revered name, may we be glad and rejoice in your salvation. And may your mercy, Lord our God, and your great kindness never leave us.
So this is an example where we see that it's overall the same text, just one is a little bit more adding phrases to it in order to bring out more compassion and more love. But let's, bottom line, say, okay, so we have many different texts, many different opinions. What is the average Jew? He grows up, he says, I want to know what's the law. What is he supposed to do? He cannot read all these different opinions from opposing rabbis and to come to a conclusion as to what he should do. One rabbi lived here, one rabbi lived there. He lives in Hawaii. There was no Jewish school of thought in Hawaii where he can follow, but is he supposed to follow the opinion from Germany, from France, from Russia? Of course, in the general opinions of large events, there are no disputes, but when it comes to small details, there might be a difference of opinions. So what is one supposed to do? As one may ask this question, from all the different halachic complications, one can go dizzy. So there was a famous rabbi that lived about 500 years ago. His name was Yosef Karo. He authored what we call today the Shulchan Aruch, literally translated as the set table. He said it's too confusing for the average person. Yes, the scholars know how to read. He decided to do what the Supreme Court used to do. The Supreme Court would get everybody together, all the rabbis, and say, what's the majority? So he did the same idea without them physically being present, but he took all the texts together and he said, let me read the text of all the opinions that were preceding to my time from the great rabbis, the ones that had differences of opinions. He read all their texts and he said, okay, let's narrow down where are the arguments. And wherever there were arguments, he said, let's look, where do we have a majority? When there's two rabbis that interpret it one way and one rabbi another way, we'll follow the majority. So he manually did what a Supreme Court would do in person. Of course, it takes a lot of work because you don't have the rabbis there at the time to argue it out. and sometimes people didn't clarify, and sometimes there was slightly different opinions, and you could have in one subject 6 different opinions. So overall, he said the rule was you go after the majority, with some exceptions, and which is explained based on the logic in that specific scenario or why it should be the case. And this is all of his commentary. This is when one studies Jewish law, it's not just the rough text. There's commentary on it, which describes as to why a certain method should be used, a certain opinion should be followed. But that's what he did. And from his times till now, you can say it's all compiling previous opinions and coming to a final verdict, coming to a conclusion and manually doing what one would do in a courtroom. So he made the first Shulchan Aruch, the first code of Jewish law, which is the most practical, the one that's followed till today. Prior to him, there were other rabbis that did similar ideas, but then as the ages went on, we constantly needed an updated version, because let's say a rabbi writes, like Maimonides, 850 years ago, he writes his opinion as to what we should follow, bottom line. But then within what he says, there's already disputes 100, 200 years later, different rabbis say different things. So a new rabbi had to come and say, okay, let's see all the disputes within the last 200 years. Let's see what's the majority, and let's come to a final conclusion. So that is what the Shulchan Aruch did, to gather everything together in order for it to be very easy for one to understand, like a set table where it's all organized. Then came another rabbi, and he said, I have a little problem just with what Rabbi Yosef Cairo did. My problem is that he compiled everything according to his customs, because he was a Sephardic rabbi. He lived in the land of Israel. I am an Ashkenazi rabbi. So mostly everything he wrote we follow, but there's 5% of the stuff that the Ashkenazi communities have a different custom. So he wrote a book, which he called a mappa, playing on the words of what his predecessor wrote, a set table. He said, I'm just going to spread out a tablecloth on your set table. I'm just going to add a little bit of wherever there's a disagreement between the Ashkenazi custom and the Sephardic custom, or wherever I disagree with how you interpret it, I'll give my verdict. So people that follow the Ashkenazi custom will be able to use your book and have it spiced up with an updated commentary that fits for their lifestyle. And that is the book that he wrote. He was called the Ramah. Moshe, it stands for Rabbi Moshe Isserlich. And that is the 2 most famous books when it comes to studying Jewish law till this very day. Of course, there's many commentary on this, and there were others that wrote afterwards as well, their own Shulchan Aruch, their own code of Jewish law, explaining all the opinions between from when they lived till now. But that is the idea of what he was trying to do, and many are copying that same method. And each group, each sect of Judaism might have someone from their group that has done that job 100 years ago, 200 years ago, to combine everything that has happened from 500 years ago, and they'll follow their code of Jewish law. So there's many, but this one that he wrote, that these 2 rabbis wrote, is considered one that all accept. And then after that, there came updated versions throughout the generations. So to give a little visual of the time, we have the Torah given 3,333 years ago, together with the oral Torah. And then at about 1,500 years ago, we have the Talmud written. Prior to that, we had about 1,800 years ago, the Mishnah, 1,500 years ago, the Talmud. And then after that, about 500 years ago, they combined the 3 greatest authorities at the time, which was the Rosh, the Rambam, and Al-Fasi. The Rambam is Maimonides. This is the Rif and the Rosh. These were 3 great leaders, each in their own community, and they combined it all into the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law. Now, lest one think that all these disputes means that one is right and one is wrong, let's read over here this text in order to get an understanding. So this is what these rabbis wrote about why they're writing their book, what I just explained outside. Here, let's use this text 19 as an example. And John, if you'd like to read this example, start from here. Here's an example, and then read text 19.
Yes, of course. Here's an example of a typical line in the, don't remember how to pronounce that, but go on. This is one refers to the laws of the blessing immediately prior to the Shema that we saw above. And then the second blessing prior to Shema begins with, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but with eternal love. Oh, what was that? Oh, okay. Others recite with great love, as is the custom of all Ashkenazi.
Very good. So this is showing you what we just explained. This is what the first rabbi, Yosef Cairo, he wrote. The second blessing is with eternal love. On that, the next rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Isserlish, the Ramah, the Ashkenazi rabbi, he wrote as a note on the side, others recite slightly different words with great love, instead of with eternal love, with great love. So this is an example, and throughout the Shulchan Aruch, throughout the Code of Jewish Law, you have this constantly on every page. You have it at least once, where he writes his law, and then the other guy writes just a small commentary, a small note of there any changes if there were between the Ashkenazi Jews versus the Sephardic Jews. Let's read over here, and Aliyah, if you'd like to read Minhag, and then text number 20.
Minhag, the proper approach. Are all these diverse rulings equally valid? Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, a noted Torah scholar in Israel, summarizes the mainstream approach to the question, namely that all these local customs and rulings are equally valid and each person should retain the custom and ruling of his or her family. Following the exile from the land of Israel and the scattering of Jewish communities, distinctions were created among this diverse ethnic groups, Edot, regarding the wording of the prayers. In the main prayers, those instituted by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, such as Birkot, Kiryat Shema, and Amidah, the differences are very slight. Even in the main passages of the Korbanot, sacrificial offerings, the Pesukei Zimra, which are established during the time of the Talmud and the Geonim, the disparities are minor. The modifications are more noticeable, however, in the supplements added during the period of the Rishonim, such as the additions to the Korbanot passages and prayers concluding the service. That was customary to include in Spain, was not necessarily accepted in Ashkenaz and vice versa. This is especially apparent in the liturgy of the high holy days and festivals composed during the time of the Geonim and the Rishonim. Hence, we find completely different Piyutim poems and the high holy day prayers of the Sephardic and Ashkenazic services. It is proper that every Jew continue in his family's custom, even if he knows that a certain nusach is more precise. The continuation of tradition is more important than the accuracy of one word or another. The Ari HaKadosh clarifies the differences in wording and style between Sephardim and Ashkenazi. He explains that there are 12 windows in the heavens corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel, and the prayer of each tribe ascends through the particular gate. That is the enigma of the 12 gates mentioned in the conclusion of the book of Ezekiel. You could even read the bottom.
Yeah, you could read that last paragraph.
You could even say that the fact that each community has its own customs today has certain advantages over the time period when there was a single form of practice. Rabbi Eliyahu Bakshi Doron, former Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel and noted Torah scholar, writes that the development of different customs allowed each community to express its unique path in the service of God and within all the framework of halachic system that was binding on all Jews equally, similar to the concept of they are both in the words of the living God, but in this case, it is so even in practice, not just theory.
Very good. So to summarize, what we're mentioning here is, like we said in the beginning of the class, that they're all from the same God. Even though in the past there was one verdict that everyone followed, today we could have that same concept apply even with each person doing their own custom, which might be slightly different. Of course, there's no grand differences. No one has a custom that we don't celebrate Passover, or that Shavuot is not the holiday when God gave us the Torah. But if one might eat cheesecake and one doesn't eat cheesecake, small differences where it's not a biblical commandment, it's Not again that one is right and one is wrong, but each one is working on the gate, the path that his soul connects with and how they connect with God. We'll use an example here. Let's pull up on the screen. What do these represent? And the answer is, we have over here the 4 departments in the military, or you can call them the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Space Force. Are they different? Of course. Each one has their own tools and what they use and how they operate, but yet, do they have the same ultimate objective? And the answer is absolutely. Not only that, but they work together in tandem. Each one has the differences that complement what the other is lacking. They work as a team and as a whole. So too with the Jewish people. Not everyone is exactly the same, but we're all there for the same objective. We're all there to serve the same God. And it might have slightly different ways that we do it, but it actually enhances and it brings a better fulfillment to the world where everything gets covered. And in a way, you could say it allows each soul to find the area, the place, the group that they feel comfortable with. If there was one form, then some Jews would feel this works for their style, and some Jews would feel it doesn't. Therefore, we have many types. So this way, a Jew that likes more of the singing, or a Jew that likes less of the singing, one that likes more intellectual, another that likes more of the emotional, everyone can find their space as long as within the same goal. As long as they're being loyal to the mission, it's all valid. Let's read over here the last text, and then we'll go to the summary of the class. And Sheila, if you'd like to read text 21.
Halakha is the same for all, and it speaks in a single language that applies to everyone equally. However, in practical expression, there are many varied customs and traditions. Just as God gave human beings the world, and the greatness of man is his ability to freely choose what happens on the earth. Similarly, halakha was given to human beings, each of whom are unique. Each person has its own path of stirring his emotions to reach the ultimate goal of the mitzvah. The various customs and practices regarding mitzvah that were developed by different communities have proven themselves to be proper manifold paths for each community to reach the goal of the mitzvah. The beauty of the picture is not in, it's not in a single color, but the range of colors that are integrated together, each one in its proper place. The beauty of the symphony is not the single tone or musical instrument, but in the varied creation that is expressed throughout a variety of instruments and tones that complement and complete each other. Similarly, regarding the communities of the Jewish people, unity does not mean the cancellation of the individual, but the building of an edifice from the bringing together of smaller parts that complement and complete each other.
Very good. So in summary, all the Jews are following the basic halachic text that we have, which includes still the Talmud, that everyone agrees. All rabbis and all communities agreed that if we want to be loyal to the text, we want to follow what God wants, there's what was a consensus amongst all the rabbis at the time. They came to a final verdict that we all follow. But after that point, any further development may have rulings that are slightly different for each community. So for example, if one eats rice on Passover or not, no one says that the Torah prohibits rice on Passover, but they'll say, for our community, we realized people were confusing rice with other grains, or the rice was too close to the other grains in the store, and therefore the rice buckets always had some kernels of grain, and therefore they prohibited it, where the other community didn't feel it necessary. So they're all valid and true, and everyone's bringing out what they feel, trying to be loyal to the Torah and do what's right. Let's read the summary for the third section. Caroline, if you'd like to read the summary.
Okay, we have covered the third and final big idea. After the Babylonian Talmud was refined, Jews migrated throughout Europe, North Africa, and Asia. With the lack of central Jewish authority, each community developed its own customs and resolutions for halakhic disputes.
Beautiful. Okay, let's go now to the key points of what we had in the class, and this would summarize everything that we discussed. So let's start with Elia, if you'd like to read the first three.
When there is a debate, a ruling is made and one opinion is followed. 2. Even though we follow one opinion, all opinions are words of the living God and must be cherished and studied. 3. Every matter has multiple layers and dimensions. Different opinions highlight different truths.
So that was the first point we were mentioning, that it's all true. God has so much unlimited wisdom in everything that he said, and each one is focusing on a different point within the general truth. Sheila, if you'd like to read 4, 5, and 6.
Okay, God's wisdom is too vast for any single perspective to fully encompass. Multiple perspectives give us a fuller spectrum of wisdom. This does not mean moral relativism. Ultimately, the law is the law.
Very good. So as much as we say that we have vast amounts of opinions, when it comes to the law, there is one final verdict. God doesn't say however one wants to interpret is completely fine. There's the general way that it's said that one has to follow, but then within the details is intentionally set up that one has to use their own creativity, their mind, as to how they understand that. Okay, Caroline, if you'd like to read 7, 8, 9.
Okay. Not every opinion is valid, only ones that have a deep understanding of the Torah. Number 8, the Supreme Court in Jerusalem served as the central halakhic authority. 9, the Supreme Court ruled based on the majority, which ensured unity and avoided anarchy.
All right, so that was extremely important, that there should be a one location where they decided what is the law for everyone. And that should have continued if the Jewish people were still in the land of Israel, obeying God's commandments. It would have continued like that forever. However, because of sin, we were exiled from the land and we lost that clarity that we used to have. However, with the situation that we're in now, we make the best of it, like we're going to explain momentarily. John, if you'd like to read 10, 11, 12.
The Supreme Court in Jerusalem eventually dissolved, which resulted in many strands of halakha. The Babylonian Talmud compiled all the opinions and served as the last central halakhic authority to date. All Jews are bound by the Talmud. After the Talmud was ratified, Jews migrated all over the world.
Very good. So just even to clarify, the Supreme Court was dissolved even before the times of the Talmud. The difference between the Supreme Court and the Talmud was Supreme Court, everybody was there in person and they came to conclusion at the time with everyone giving their opinion. The Talmud came to conclusion without everyone there. It was compiled of hundreds of years of rabbi statements, and then the final rabbi said, let's put everybody's statements together and let's come to a final verdict. But not every person was there to voice their opinions. Some of them was just a previous generation's opinion, but they came to a final verdict at the time. Okay, let's continue. Sheila, if you'd like to read 13, 14, and 15.
This resulted in a lack of central authority. Many strains of halakha developed since then, with no one being bound by another. All strains are therefore valid.
Right. So today's day and age, of course, this is part of God's plan, and this is what's available. Everything is valid because there was no Supreme Court to decide that we follow one method. And therefore, each one is bringing out from the source of their soul and how their soul is supposed to connect with God, the method that is available, the custom that is around in their community. And Caroline, if you'd like to read the last two.
Okay, so 16. Some even celebrate plurality. 17, plurality is not anarchy. A credible halakhic system must be followed.
Very good. So it's beautiful, and it's something that we should celebrate as well, that we have this opportunity now. However, we must remember that it doesn't break down that there's no more system where everybody can do as they please, but rather it's for those that are being loyal to the text, following the guidelines, and then bringing out their plurality within the system. Beautiful. That's the end of this class.